All right, war fans, let's get our notes ready. We're going to put World War I in a nutshell. Try to follow along and focus on the map as much as possible. So we remember, I hope so, immediately following the assassination of Franz Ferdinand in Bosnia, Serbia and Austria were engaged in conflict. Meanwhile, the Germans invaded Luxembourg, this tiny little country between Germany and France. It was a precautionary measure to prevent the French from invading German territory. Have you ever heard the best defense is a good offense? The Germans executed a plan that was named after their army's chief of staff. This dude right here, Alfred von Schlieffen. The Schlieffen plan was intended to quickly attack and outflank the enemy before they could even respond. It probably would have worked too, except for two things. One, they wanted to capture Paris and take France out of the war before it began. It makes sense. Should have worked, right? But the French were not easily defeated. In fact, they'd been building up their army for years, just like the Germans. They put up a strong defense. Well, the plan was to march through Belgium and attack Paris from the north, and the Germans had no problem doing that. The Belgian forces put up very little resistance, and they marched right through. Right when they're about to capture Paris, the Germans turned away and tried to surround the French forces in the east of France. This was called the strategy of annihilation. In other words, it wasn't good enough to just defeat your enemy. You had to annihilate them so they couldn't fight you back. This was a mistake, and quickly the British and northern French forces counterattacked the Germans from behind and pushed them all the way back in retreat to Belgium. This gave time for the French to dig in, and dig in they did. 500 miles of trenches from the north to the south. The Germans dug in too, and the Western Front was created. A virtual stalemate or standoff. Meanwhile, in the east, Russia attempts to attack Germany and Austria-Hungary. This is going to divert German troops away from the Western Front to the Eastern Front. Now Germany's bogged down in the trenches because they don't have the numbers needed to overcome the British and the French. Despite some major gains by both sides, the Western Front would remain bogged down for 3 continuous years of fighting. Let's switch focus now. By 1915, the Bulgarians joined the Central Powers and attacked Serbia from the south. The whole time Austria was attacking from the north. Serbia falls quickly. Then the Italians, they pull a dirty trick. They turn on their own allies, join the French, and they attack the Austrians in Slovenia. We mentioned that the Ottomans had joined the Germans in 1914, and they found themselves engaged on all sides by Russians and British, seeking to capture their oil fields, mostly in the east. And in the west, the British in the Sinai wanted to control the Suez Canal. A future British Prime Minister by the name of Winston Churchill, he's kind of a big deal, will devise a plan to attack Austria from Bulgaria. And to do so, they must pass through the Dardanelles Straits. Once again, just like the Germans underestimated the power of the French, the British underestimated the power of the Turks. They were dealt horrific losses in an attempt to capture control of Turkish artillery positions at a place called Gallipoli. As all sides grew weary of death and endless stalemates on all of the fronts, the Germans take a daring stand by launching what was called unrestricted submarine warfare. They broke the British blockade in the North Sea and eventually began sinking ships in the Atlantic. These ships were supplying the British and the French from the United States, who was actually neutral in the entire engagement. Unfortunately, in 1917, the Germans sunk a passenger ship, the HMS Lusitania, which carried not only munitions to the British, but 128 American passengers. This would finally pull the Americans into the war, who had previously refused to take sides in the quote-unquote European war. At the same time, the Russians had lost 1.7 million soldiers. They were sick of the war. They had a lot of own internal problems: starvation, dissension against the Tsar. This led to a revolution. So they abandoned fighting on the Eastern Front and began internal fighting within Russia. Soon the Bolsheviks seized power following this bloody infighting, and their new leader, Vladimir Lenin, signed an armistice agreement with Germany. What's left of the German army then reconcentrates all of its power back on the Western Front and makes a major offensive towards Paris. But with the help of the Americans, the Allies then push the Germans back and they begin to retreat. In Germany, the people and many military leaders turn against the Kaiser, and he is forced into exile in the Netherlands. German generals sign an armistice or ceasefire at the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918, and the First World War comes to an end. Soon the Allies would prepare a treaty blaming the Germans for the war, which will have long-lasting and devastating consequences for the entire world.